Oh,
That's
Having
true.
played in an all Warlock game, I was like, oh god, if we don't have short rests, we're
that
just
is
useless.
hilarious.
Hi, welcome to How to D&D. My name is Fred Wheeler, and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons 5e, specifically about what happens if you start taking some of the core rules and tearing them out and making them optional or variant rules. But this is a Dungeon Master roundtable discussion, and I have some friends with me to help me because I couldn't do it alone. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, folks. I'm Dawn from Roll for Initiative.
Hey folks, Wally from the Wally DM channel. Thanks for having me, Fred.
Hell yeah. And I'm Josiah from the Dungeon Dad YouTube channel.
So what would happen if we took the short rest and just took it out of the game? We're going to rip that out, throw it off into the dump. And like, what happens to your game when you decide that the short rest is no longer part of the core rules and it's just a optional rule or variant rule, or it just doesn't exist anymore? Because I know there's a few people who have considered that maybe the short rest is like not worth the effort, and maybe they just let's get rid of it. So, Dawn, what would you say are the pros and cons, or positives and negatives, of ditching the short rest for Dungeons and Dragons 5e?
So I think taking the short rest out, it does kind of keep things moving along and forces the players to kind of be a little bit more mindful of how they're using all their abilities, and especially dealing with healing, that you all of that throughout the day. It also avoids the arguments at the table when one person wants to take a short rest and the rest of the party wants to keep going, that you're sitting there waiting for them to decide. But I think the reason that I would never take out short rest from the game is because it really negatively impacts a number of classes' abilities that reset on a short rest, and it basically makes warlocks like useless, because either you run through the handful of spells that you get and then have absolutely nothing the rest of the day, or you have to be like, well, I'm only going to ever cast a spell if I absolutely need to, and it just kind of nerfs that class, which I think is a very interesting class and can be very fun to play.
You know, I had to think about that myself, and I'm going to jump in here just really quickly and just say, look, I think the Warlock and its spell slots should reset after every encounter. I think that's really where it should have been in the first place with Dungeons and Dragons 5e, rather than, oh, you have to take a short rest to get your spell slots back, which basically means as a Warlock player, you only had 2 spells, and if you got 3 rounds, I mean, your other choices, you're going to just cast cantrips or use invocations the whole time. But then, of course, with the invocations, you're picking up utility stuff because you want to use the stuff that's going to use most often. And since most of the invocations tend to be utility anyway, like, well, it makes it's a no-brainer that, yeah, I really think it should have just been, you get your spell slots at the end of an encounter, like Dungeons and Dragons 4e. And I know the rest of you are all disappearing and running away, and like, don't freak out, man. That's, I think, where the Warlock worked best, is it got its spell slots and they just recharged, even though you only had a couple of them, every single encounter. And then they don't, because what has to happen with players who run a Warlock, right, is they'll go and like, I want to take a short rest after every single battle, because that was the only way they could get their spell slots back. So just get rid of that problem. And like, no, you get them back every single battle and be done with it.
Yeah, that works if you're running a encounter heavy, but if you got kind of a mix, I think that runs into a weird, like, when do they reset?
That's very true. Like, after every role play encounter. But like, what does that mean? Can I go talk to the shopkeeper and be like, hey dog, what's up? Nice day out. Cool, got my fireballs back. Thanks, bye.
I'm going to combine mine, pros and cons, and it's going to be a pro or a con, depending on how you want to look at it. Now, a little bit of background for myself is I jumped from basic / AD&D straight into first edition Pathfinder, 5th edition. So short rests were brand new to me. What we did in AD&D was you get a night's rest and you got 1 hit point plus your constitution modifier. There was no short rest during the day, and that was your maximum hit points. So my characters were accumulating a sword +1 cure light wounds was like, that was like gold to them, because they'd have like 5 or 6 of those, and they'd come out of a heavy battle and they're like all passing the sword, these swords around trying to cure themselves. And then of course healing potions were absolutely essential for them. If you want to have that old school feel to your game, if you want that grit, and I think Josiah, you could probably expand on this in a little bit more too, that this is actually a variant rule. If you want that grit, if you want that old school feel, then move short rest to the long rest position. So instead of a long rest, you get everything back. Short rest, you get maybe some of your spell slots, and then you get a roll for hit die, or slow it down even more than that. Now, that's a con, because if the dungeon master wants to play that way and the players don't, then they're probably not going to be too happy about that. Not only that, but your number of combat encounters are going to have to be less and far few in between if you're only getting a set amount of hit points back.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. It certainly, it certainly does change the way you would structure things. Josiah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it changes things a lot, which again is a classic prawn. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. It's funny, like talking about the gritty realism stuff. That campaign which we played in was a very interesting D&D campaign, because it made me think about the game in a way that I hadn't thought about before. That campaign being the one where we did those gritty realism resting rules. Every point of damage you took mattered so much more, because it was like, damn, I'm going to be spending hit dice on our night's rest, and like you don't get that free full heal until we stop somewhere for an entire week. I also in that campaign made the decision to play a wizard, which I knew was putting myself at a disadvantage slightly, but it ended up being really fascinating, because your encounters do become fewer and far between, because the Dungeon Master's Guide says you're supposed to have like 5 encounters per adventuring day or whatever. Is it 6?
6.
It is
to 8.
6 to 8. Yeah. And so that's what I mean. Like that is bonkers insane to me. Like it's one of those things where when I read that, I'm like, whoever wrote this did not speak to a human being that play tested this game. It's one of those things where it's like, that's just completely ridiculous. 6 to 8 is wild. Obviously, there's a lot of debate there for what that means, but by doing gritty realism, what you're doing is basically stretching out the time of that adventuring day into like an adventuring week, so to speak. So like you only get like maybe 4 or 5 long short rests, which were every night when we would go to sleep. But during the span of time between long rests, we would have like 5 to 7 encounters usually, right? So it kind of basically gave me a good glimpse into what it feels like if you actually are abiding by the 6 to 8 encounters rule, at least in terms of resource management. And it was really interesting because like as a wizard, obviously I had access to fireball and some pretty powerful spells and stuff, but I started really taking a lot more rituals and taking things that didn't consume resources. I also made the choice to play an abjuration wizard and do one of my favorite tricks, which is where you just ritual cast alarm a bunch of times before you go to bed to charge up your abjuration magic shield, which is kind of cheesy, but in a game like that, it was like necessary to survive. So you start doing stuff that you would never normally do or consider, because the short rest, long rest thing can really change that up. But yeah, I guess in terms of what my actual con would be is I think that ultimately, like Don said, it does give your players less resources, which is almost never a good thing, unless you're going for that like gritty, intense, more lethal game style, which like literally everything, as I always say, it comes down to the game and the players and like what you want. Like if you posit this to your players, like we're going to switch to gritty long rest rules, or like we're just taking short rest out entirely, and they say that sounds really challenging and fun, then like great. If they say I hate that and I hate you now, then maybe consider not doing it. I guess it just holds potential to change up the game in a huge way, and whether that's a good or bad thing really depends on your group. you just have to keep in mind that by doing that, it is going to be punishing all of your short rest classes. It's like your warlocks, your fighters.
Coming into 5th edition, I let's say like a zombie took a bite out of your arm, and with current rules, you wake up the next day and it's just like it's all healed and you're up at max hit points. But like, oh man, didn't that zombie do a number on you? Weren't you down? Maybe you were making some death saving throws, to allude to a previous video that's on this channel. But you've got like all these chunks out of you, and the next day you're just like fine. But where you install the grittiness and those variant rules with where the short rests are after 24 hours and long rests are a week or whatever else. Now you're actually having to take time to heal. You're putting your bandages on and stuff, allowing you to role play those out a little bit. So I think it's very interesting what you could do by taking out the short rest. But honestly, I like having it in there. I like recharging in the morning and having everything back, just like, dun, here I am. I got everything back. Let's go.
The way that D&D is set up right now, like changing nothing, it's designed to give you that like high fantasy, like epic adventure feel. Like the characters are heroes, right? Like it's designed that way. And I think that's what the 5th edition team was going after when they set things up the way they did. By switching to that gritty realism thing, it suddenly becomes a lot more like, oh man, like, no, this is a lot more dangerous. Like, yes, we're heroic characters, but taking 5 damage at level like 3 or 4 usually doesn't matter. You come out of a fight with some goblins and your character took 5 damage, you're like, okay, this is gonna stick with me until I take a short rest. And even then, I only have 4 hit dice. So like, it's not like I can just heal myself infinitely. Whereas in that case, in a normal situation, a normal game of D&D, you take your short rest, you roll 2 hit dice, you go great. And then by the time you take your long rest that night, it's completely forgotten, right? Whereas in this case, we've had instances where players like, wait, how do you only have that much hit points left? And it's like, remember that fight with those goblins 3 days ago? And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. You got shot by like 5 arrows. It's like, yeah, I'm near death, like, and will be until we take like a month off work, basically.
Yeah, and I think this is one where it's really important, if you are gonna like take the rule out, that the table is like on board, that you have that discussion ahead of time. Because yeah, if you're playing a class that has one of those abilities, you might be like, oh, I'll pick the wizard instead of the warlock, or something like that.
Exactly. I feel like it's definitely one of those cases where, like, more than anything else we've talked about, you definitely want to make sure your players are all on board. Like if I show up to like a convention game or something and I sit down, the DM's just like, by the way, we don't do short rest, I'm gonna be like, cool, have a nice day. Like that's fine, but like that's something you need to know beforehand, because that's going to inform your character class choices, your build choices, like everything that goes into the character you're making. It's a showing of disrespect to just be like, hey, that thing in the game, we're just changing that completely without talking about it. Sit down and play. It's like, okay, no. Like, yeah.
So I was looking at the short rest, and to actually decouple the short rest from Dungeons and Dragons 5e is actually very, very difficult because it impacts the game in so many different ways. They have tied it and locked it in place with anchors and then bolted it in place. So you have to do an awful lot of stuff and realize what its effect is. So I found, again, the cons tend to fall on the player's side. It's not something that players are really going to want. And the pros tend to fall on the dungeon master side. And you can just forget about hit dice. So regaining hit points from using hit dice just wouldn't occur anymore. You'd have to take a long rest to get your hit points back, because you wouldn't have hit dice anymore. That mechanic would just be, it would be gone. You're not just getting rid of the short rest, you get rid of hit dice as well, because they don't have any other purpose other than usually during a short rest. For those of you who dislike the idea of being able to identify the property of a magic item during a short rest, well, you don't have to worry about that now, because if the short rest is gone, they're going to have to use the identify spell, and she's done and dusted. I mean, you could still say that, I guess you can fondle the thing for an hour and you understand how it works, or you handle it or swing it around or use it in some way. You could still use, that as a way of identifying stuff. There are so many classes and so many features that recharge on a short rest, as people have already indicated. But there's something that the Wizards of the Coast team has done recently. They don't, almost all of the features now that they put out for new subclasses and anything else do not recharge on a short rest. I'm pretty sure almost all of them no longer recharge on a short rest. And I think that means that Wizards of the Coast is probably going to ditch the short rest mechanic in some form, whether it be for 5e, 5.5 or 6 in the future. And instead they've put in place a replacement, and that's basically that you get to use that feature a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, and it recharges on a long rest. And I think that is probably what you want to do. If you're going to take out the short rest and you've got some features that are reliant on recharging on a short rest, then you're probably going to have to put this into place as a replacement so that those classes can actually work properly. Otherwise, they kind of fall apart and they don't recharge on a short rest anymore. Yeah. So yeah, and that's probably the only way to do it and make it make sense. Whether it be, I think there would be some times where getting your proficiency bonus at higher levels to get all those features back might wind up being a bit much. But then again, there was never a limitation on the number of short rests that you could take anyway during an adventuring day, other than the number of hours in the day, since it's only an hour, right? So you could take a short rest, do something for a few minutes, and then take another short rest and do something for a few minutes and just keep rolling that through. That essentially meant that you could almost have 24 of them, depending on how much space you put between them. It could be just seconds, you're pretty close to the 20 mark if you really wanted to. And then the pros, I feel, are the reason that it tends to be pulled up is Dungeon Masters. It's not just complexity for Dungeon Masters, because it is quite a complicated process, the short rest. It is the fact that they want to try to build more challenging combat encounters. And because they're reliant on trying to slowly whittle down the resources of a party, sometimes that's not very easy to do based on how Dungeons and Dragons 5e set up. And so there's a very sort of a strong sense of, we'll just get rid of the short rest and just have the long rest and we're all good. And I think that's where I think that plays more into the hands of a dungeon master who's looking for that, to try to make the fights harder. I think you would probably see a different style of play from players. I think they would have to start looking at how the game was played by many groups early on, where you avoided combat and you had to look at an alternative where you sneak past them, deceive them, or bribe them. A lot of bribe. Your gold is going to be gone very fast on this game. You're going to probably find that you're going to have to try to make friends a few times, and you might decide that, like, no, there's too much. We're going back to the tavern and get drunk for a little while and do something else, and then we'll come back when we're a bit higher level, or we can be bothered. I think that's probably going to look at a very different style of play. I don't know that our player base, in terms of the wider community, is ready for that kind of game, because Wizards of the Coast moved away from that when TSR really had set up the game in a very particular way, where you really had to be quite smart and clever. And the average player is not really thinking that way. They're not really thinking, what's the best, smartest way I can do this, the most efficient way without ever lifting a sword or casting a spell. I don't think our player base works like that nowadays.
I have a very different player base.
Pardon? Well,
I have a very different player base.
Well, that's true. I mean, every player base is going to be. I mean, I think in the general sense, I think the current player base has been trained to think in terms of Dungeons and Dragons as combat, even though they say there are 3 pillars.
So, sorry to jump in. I think that's actually, I run into that. A lot of newer players approach it less combat focused than people who are coming from older editions. It's just something that I've noticed as I am a newer player to it. 5th edition was my first one. I think that also can sometimes be, like, depending on the age of the player as well, because I know some of the younger players, they get introduced sometimes as, like, you go fight the monsters, because that's an easy encounter to kind of give kids, where it's a clear set of paths, whereas I feel like a lot of the more intrigue and social games can be a little bit harder for, like, elementary school kids to understand.
Yeah, like having, like, political intrigue.
Yeah.
Like, 12-year-olds can be tricky.
Mhm.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that because I I think that there's definitely like when you talk about like Wizards taking over, like specifically with the advent of third edition, there's definitely a big paradigm shift there. I do think that combat is typically presented as the easiest outcome to a lot of situations. It requires the least amount of like finesse, I guess, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that unless your players want to find a way outside of combat to deal with stuff, they're not going to, right? Like if I'm just like, hey, there's a thing you're trying to get and it's being guarded by like a bunch of orcs or something that live here. Like the easiest solution to that problem is, all right, we'll just go fight them and then take the thing that we need. But that doesn't mean you can't like try to make terms with them, find out why they're fighting against the people who live in this village, try to negotiate some type of equitable trade route between the two of them. Like there's always the option to do that, right? But the game is built with combat as such an accessible and easy thing to do. Whereas I do think you are right about that, Fred, that in older editions, combat was a lot more punishing, which inherently meant that it was almost always going to be your last option, right? So like even if you wanted to storm the place and fight those orcs or whatever, you couldn't just do that. Like if you were dead set on fighting them, you would have to get help. You would have to go hire mercenaries to like come and help you do it. And it was going to be a whole thing. Whereas now, I think the power level of players on average is usually a bit higher, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. It just means that if combat is your first and last solution, there's less that you have to do to make that happen, right? You can just go in and the expectation is that the DM is going to throw an encounter at you that's doable. Whereas I don't think that was the case before. I do think there's been a big shift in how what we expect of dungeon masters. We're like, oh, if there's an orc encampment here and we're meant to go get this thing, if we choose combat, it's expected that the DM is going to give us like an orc war chief and like 8 orcs to fight or whatever. Whereas in like AD&D, I feel like the expectation would be we're gonna have to fight 60 orcs all at the same time, and that's straight up not possible unless we also hire like 40 guys to come help us do this, right? So I don't know what it is that changed there. I might just have to do with like how modules are presented and stuff like that. But I think that there was definitely a big paradigm shift where if combat is the choice, it's made a lot more doable.
And I also just rests make it a lot more doable to do combat multiple times.
The other thing is, I don't want to put this all on and say, oh, that players aren't smart enough and capable enough nowadays to be able to do this. You've got to understand that it's not just about that. It's also, players are trained. The group itself, the other players train other players. The dungeon master trains players and the players train the dungeon master. It goes both ways. So you don't just need to have players who are capable of dealing with the fact there isn't a short rest and dealing with things other than fighting. You have to have dungeon masters who are open to the idea that, yes, the guard can be bribed or they can be tricked or you can sneak past them and it's not impossible because you haven't set a DC of like 30, which they'll probably not be able to achieve ever. Unless, of course, they are now level 20 or a bit higher or something like that. So it's really dependent on the whole community to be able to do something like that. If you were to put it globally, but in your group, you need to have dungeon master and players who are capable of dealing with the consequences of suddenly looking at alternatives outside of combat and eliminating that short rest.
I think that's very true. And that's a really important thing to understand is that like as a DM, every decision that you are making with how you want to handle something that a player does is telling your players this is how this is going to go in the future. Like you're always setting precedence whether you realize it or not. It's like if they try to negotiate with someone and you just straight up like flatter like that's not going to work, that's then informing them like, okay, that's not really a way that we can do that, at least with this DM. And like if you are just running a game that you want to be all about combat, that's fine. That's not necessarily wrong. It's just you know, like you said, you're teaching your players, and vice versa, your players are teaching you, because they're trying to see, like, every time I've ever played with a new group, the first like couple sessions is always the DM and the group feeling each other out. Like the group feeling like, okay, this is what I can get away with, this is what I can't, this is kind of the style that our DM rewards. You know, like if you're constantly trying to find ways to subvert combat and your DM like lets you, because like rules wise they can't think of a reason not to let you do that, but ultimately like you're punished for it either by not getting the same amount of rewards or whatever, that's then teaching your players like you should be fighting unless you want to get a lesser outcome, right? Whereas if you don't do that, you're then teaching your players like, yeah, like this is the problem, solve it however you want, you're going to get the same result either way, right? I know we've had a lot of or I have had a lot of learning and experience with that. We're currently my partner and I, we are doing a one-on-one D&D campaign set in Theros. I knew I'd find a way to sneak it in here somewhere. But Fred hates it when I talk about Theros. We've been doing this one-on-one campaign, which we've done 3 sessions of now, and it's really interesting because she is alone. I mean, there's one NPC now who has kind of like tagged along, she's made friends with, but like every encounter becomes a lot more dangerous. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the death saving throw things, is there aren't really death saving throws, because if she goes down, like we make the death saving throws, but that's to determine whether or not she's captured or dead, because she's unconscious. Like you can't do anything when you're by yourself, right? So like we had an encounter recently where phase 1 there was a bridge, merchants were crossing it, and they were being attacked by Return, which is a monster from Theros. They're like zombies, kind of, doesn't matter. They were being ambushed by a gang basically, and she's like, okay, I'm a heroic person, I want to be a hero, I'm going to stop them. Great. She intervenes, they have a couple of rounds of combat, and then a troll who lives under the bridge comes up and is just fighting everyone. So now there's like 3 parties, and she's trying to like position herself between the troll and these guys. And of course, once the bandits effectively were defeated, it was just the troll left, and it was her. And she's like, cool, I'm facing down a troll at like level, I think she was level 4 at the time. This is like a really dangerous circumstance. And her thought was like, you know what? I'm going to try to negotiate with it. So she literally just like put her weapon away and like held out some gold and was like, if you kill me, I'll never be able to give you tribute again, but I'm going to have to cross this bridge a bunch. So if you let me live, you'll get this, and then you'll get every tribute from me whenever I pass. And the people she saved, fortunately, were gem merchants, and they threw a couple gems to troll as well. And the troll was like, cool, grabbed all the stuff, went under the bridge. And because trolls are like not the smartest individuals, but they're not complete idiots. So from the troll's perspective, it's like, I gain nothing by killing you, and if you're going to keep giving me stuff, like, awesome. So I thought that was like a really clever appeal to the nature of that creature, because it showed not only a willingness to think outside the box, but she's also engaging with the world at that point, right? And like, if I had forced her to fight and she killed the troll, cool, there's a dead troll and she throws it off the bridge. But now that troll is like an NPC sort of. So anytime she goes through that path, this troll is going to come up and like, he has a name now and he has a personality and they have like a rapport, like, and it's just like a fun part of the game. Whereas if I had just simply forced, like, I definitely made her roll a persuasion check for sure, because that's why we have checks, but I don't know, in doing so, it's just added more to the game than forcing combat. I just realized that we like have gotten so off topic because this is about short rests originally, but whatever.
Did she take a short rest after that battle?
Yes, she did take a short rest with the gem merchants after that battle.
Yeah, maybe with the troll, they like both had like some tea and caught up on things and stuff.
Short rests, I think, also, I guess, to bring it back, that's something else I wanted to say. Short rests are a good opportunity for role play, and I think that that's something that gets overlooked a lot. I used to institute a system where whenever the players took a short rest, we'd have this little moment where they're sitting around the fire, and any one player, like, we would go around the circle. If someone didn't want to take their turn, they could skip it, but we would go around. It's like, oh, it's a short rest. Okay, it's this person's turn. And they could share a little tidbit about their character's backstory or something, just like as to represent the fact that they're on this adventure with these companions, and like slowly things are being revealed about them as time goes on. And they sometimes would choose to role play it, and like they'd have a little conversation. We had fun little moments that way. And if they were someone who wasn't really comfortable with that aspect of the game yet, sometimes they would just like tell us from a meta perspective and be like, yeah, I tell you a story about whatever. So like, I don't know, there's lots of different little ways you can make short rests more interesting, I think.
But as far as each of you are concerned, how many short rests do you allow in a day? I think two is what it says in the book, but I could be wrong. I go maximum 2.
I don't think I've ever actually run into running a game where players wanted to take more than a short rest in the day.
1.
Yeah.
So I haven't run into that where I've had to look up.
I also don't ever institute. I've never had a party where I had to institute a hard cap. I think if I ran into a situation where the party was just like constantly taking short rests, I would just start ambushing them more. I would just be like, okay, like this is our 3rd rest. You guys have basically just been camping in this one spot all day. Something has taken notice.
So for me, I don't even care about how many short rests they take, because I've run characters right up to level 20. And one of the first things you discover is they don't take very much damage. And the first thing they want to do is they don't really want a long rest because they've got so many spells, but they don't want to use their spells on healing themselves. So they're like, we want to take a short rest. And I've had players take gobs and gobs and gobs of short rests. Of course, they're in a secure, safe place because they've learned their lesson and because Fred ambushes them when they don't put themselves in a safe location, or Lemon's tiny hut, or rope trick, or a variety of other spells that allow them to hide in safe extra dimensional spaces. So I've seen at high level short rests coming like a flow. It's like a river just flowing through the game. So yeah, that's
where you get like stuff like the coffee warlock, right?
Yeah,
that just capitalizes on short rests. For anyone watching who doesn't know what I'm talking about, that's when you take a warlock and you multi-class them with a sorcerer, and when you take a long rest, you actually don't take a long rest, you just take 8 short rests until you can no longer bear the weight of your exhaustion. And because the warlock gets their spell slots back every short rest, you just every time you finish a rest, you convert those spell slots into sorcery points using the sorcerer's ability. So then by the time you wake up in the morning, you might have a level or 2 of exhaustion, but you have like 50 spells worth of sorcery points that you can just annihilate everything with. And if one of your warlock or one of your sorcerer spell slots is dedicated to fireball, it's like, cool, I can cast fireballs 37 times today. And then you just go into any encounter and you just blow the shit out of everything. It's the only character build straight up that I just, if someone wants to do this, I'm just like, no. It's literally the only character build I've ever seen in 5th edition that if someone pauses that at the table, I'm just like, I'm not gonna let you do that because it's ridiculous. But it is kind of just like a funny example of stretching the rules. So I guess that's my pro.
Let us know down in the comments. Have you taken the short rest out of your game, or are you planning to do so? And hopefully this discussion has given you enough tools to decide whether you want to do it or tell us if we're wrong or right. I mean, it doesn't matter. But yeah, use the comment section. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your insight into this particular role. And where can they find you if they need to find you for anything?
Well, you can find me on YouTube here at Roll for Initiative. That's with the number 4, and Twitter and Instagram at R4iVlog.
And you can find me on my YouTube channel, Wally DM. I talk about traps and puzzles for your game. And I'm also on Twitter at Wally D2.
And you can find me primarily on YouTube, on the Dungeon Dad YouTube channel. You can also find me on Twitter. If you go to Twitter, you're going to have to search for @DungeonPapa because Dungeon Dad is taken by some clown who had their account banned like 10 years ago.
So thank you for that. Hey, make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified for all channels. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.
Okay. Gosh damn that fly. my dogs chewed up my fly swatter.
Oh no.
And it's funny because there's flies in here because I leave the back door open so they could go back and forth because they like to do that. And now I'm paying for it. And they chewed up my only means of defense. And so I have no opportunity attacks against the flies.
Inspiring with the flies.